Welcome to Drive Time Exchange. As rubber hits the road, hard talk meets great music. Monday to Thursday, 4 to 6 p.m. on NETT Radio, taking you above and beyond.
From ever since time began, has been inflicted time and again by man against fellow man. Yet man wouldn't learn from history. It makes him more violent, producing deadly weaponry with nothing but evil intent. So the war could never be over, peace will never be seen, long as man in his quest for power keep destroying fellow human beings. Human being, I'm telling you, nobody, oh nobody. When you really think of it, nobody wins a war, because the agony of defeat will linger. Nations still hating one another and superpowers, they're looking for more power. As long as violence and aggression still dwell in the hearts of man, brother, the war will go on. It cannot be won. No, the war will go on. It cannot be won. Fallout from war is chaos. Plenty agony, plenty pain. Economy left in shambles.
All right, everybody, and of course, good afternoon to you. And of course, welcome wherever you may be, Trinidad and Tobago, neighbors in the Caribbean, friends who are streaming all around the globe. We welcome you to another edition of the Drive Time Exchange. Of course, it is New Era TT Radio. We take you above and beyond. And of course, inside of the Drive Time Exchange, Monday and a Tuesday, we are led by none other than journalist extraordinaire himself, Tony Fraser. So, Tony, how are you this afternoon?
I am okay. It's good. It feels good. The weather outside is quite. It's been a little bit cool, a little bit warm at times, but generally somewhere in between there and quite good in the areas that I am. So all is well for this afternoon, and leading, of course, to some cricket this evening up at the Brian Lara Stadium. But that's another story. Let's see how the Trinidad and Tobago Night Riders go.
Yeah,
so that's the situation for today. How has it been for you?
It has been a pretty decent day. Just like you said, it was cool. I got a really nice shower after lunch. It didn't last too long, but it felt good.
Right. All right. So we are continuing, as it were, our chat and our observation, the analyses and so on of what transpired over the weekend, mainly that is that Prime Minister, well, first of all, the External Affairs Minister, the Foreign Minister, made a statement about the potential conflict of the American warships coming into the region and the known contest between Washington and Caracas, and the history of that going on for some time, inclusive, of course, of Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, where we are, 8, 10, 12 miles from a certain point off the coast. That's the northeastern coast of Venezuela. I hope I got my geography right. And so that we are involved very much, and the statement of the Prime Minister is well known. She supports the United States coming into the region too, she indicates, to deal with drug trafficking, the cartels that are involved in drug trafficking, and also be conscious of the state of Guyana and the threats which have come from Caracas. And in all of that, there has been criticism and there has been support on the other hand. Yesterday we had the position of the People's National Movement, the opposition party, coming from, first of all, the foreign minister and then the political leader of the People's National Movement. We also had some readouts, as it were, from one of them being from our first guest this afternoon. We're going to introduce him in a moment. And we also had some interesting comments coming from people on the side, callers who called into us to talk about the situation. So we're going to do our program in like two parts this afternoon. First, we're going to hear from Richard Anthony Lynch, who wrote a very interesting piece on Facebook, looking at the technicalities of a diplomatic response in the situation. He is a former retired, doesn't look too retired to me, looks like a young fella still. Diplomat, somebody with army experience and so on, and he has a notion which he expressed on Facebook, as I indicated, about how such diplomatic approaches can be made. And he doesn't say this, but I'm saying this part, rather than what was clearly a political response from the Prime Minister, jumping off almost into the middle of a situation somewhere out in the Gulf, actually, while her foreign minister was a little bit more conservative. But another, the ambassador to CARICOM, talking about regime change in Caracas, I suppose driven by Washington, but all of those complications notwithstanding. So we're going to start off with Richard Anthony Lynch to talk about what he has written about regarding what could be a technically and a sensible diplomatic approach to the American ships coming into the region. Welcome to the program, sir.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your listening audience for having me. I'm really committed to trying to add value to this very complex issue that we are trying to treat with as a society and certainly a regional community. So I look forward to participating.
Now, so one of the things that struck me, perhaps my interpretation of the fundamental statement that you made is that we don't simply jump off and make a statement, but there are all kinds of matters involved which have to be thought about, analyzed before we can come up with a kind of statement that can stand up in terms of our own involvement in this matter. You go ahead.
Yeah, so Tony, I have a very interesting background. I was Director of International Affairs at the Ministry of National Security for just about 7 years. Before that, I was a senior military officer in our defense force. So, matters of this nature, especially when you're dealing with not just the possibility, but the probability of war, it's important for military professionals and other types of advisors. Are you hearing me?
Yeah, we heard you. Go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, it's extremely important for policy advisors who are not necessarily interested in the sometimes counterproductive nature of our politics to make a contribution to the national dialogue. And so it's in that context I decided to write publicly on this issue. I mean, in other countries, a statement from a head of government like that, usually you see generals and colonels and other retired persons weighing in on it in the policy space. And that's the spirit in which I decided to write and certainly to come onto your program. Now, an important part of the concept of what I was writing about is captured by a French statesman called Charles de Gaulle. And he makes the point that no nation has friends, only interests. And I was inspired to write on the basis of that framework, because I think fundamentally the discussion should be what is in the best interest of Trinidad and Tobago. And when we begin to unpick and unpack the complexity of what we're dealing with, I think that it is important for us to interrogate first and foremost how do we arrive at a foreign policy framework to address the complexity of what we're doing, right? And fundamental to that, in terms of the formulation of any foreign policy on such complex matters, is that you resist at all costs the risk of leaving any of your policy options off the table.
Okay. In your assessment, to start with, did the statement take that into consideration? The statement, I mean, by the Prime Minister?
Well, I think I can't speak on behalf of what the Prime Minister intended to say, but certainly as a policy consultant and somebody who has been in the belly of the beast per se, I thought that it is important, and I think it is important for us to consider a number of factors. Firstly, the role of international relations is primarily to avoid war at all costs. And it's important that our statements, especially when we're articulating foreign policy statements on matters that does not directly threaten our sovereignty and our sovereign integrity, that we err on the side of ensuring that we are clear on all of the options that are available to us to avoid war at all costs. So I think, I would leave it for the public to assess what the Prime Minister's comments are, but certainly as somebody who can weigh in on it, I think that's an important contribution to make towards assessing where we go forward.
Mm-hmm. How do you assess the approach taken by the Prime Minister and presumably the government with regard to the relationships and the institutional connections that we have with CARICOM?
Well, first and foremost, CARICOM is a treaty-based organization. And being a treaty-based organization, there are certain arrangements that we have an obligation to our brothers and sisters in CARICOM to ensure. As far back as the 2003, we established a CARICOM Treaty for Security Assistance. And that treaty essentially is designed for resource mobilization across CARICOM member states. But a key part of this is the extent to which the country that is in need of assistance must make a request to be assisted. And that's fundamental when we think about CARICOM and its obligation to the security of member states. There has to be a request, and that request usually triggers some kind of arrangement among us as member states. So my first caution would be the extent to which we explore what our position is on any issue that threatens the sovereignty and security of member states, and that we enact the treaty to ensure that we mobilize our resources around that threat. Now, that does not negate the fact that some threats are beyond what we as a CARICOM or Caribbean community can pursue, and so we may look towards extra-regional partners to be able to provide further assistance. But it's all part of the complexity of arriving at a foreign policy strategy. But so you don't leave anything off the table, and that's my point. You have to leave the opportunity to work with your CARICOM partners on the basis of existing treaty arrangements among us as an important option for the country on matters of this complex nature.
Right. So I take it, given your statement, that you do not agree with the Prime Minister's statement, that's a Trinidad and Tobago Prime Minister, to the effect that Trinidad and Tobago will look after itself, and each of the countries, or together perhaps, they can look after themselves in the circumstances.
Well, Tony, I spent a lot of years advising policymakers. My role is really to offer advice. I don't know and can't speak for what the process by which the Prime Minister would have pursued the policy options that was clearly outlined for the public in the official statement. But what I can say is that it is important to keep all of your options on the table. CARICOM is too important a regional body for the question of intervention or support for the security of a member state to not cause the CARICOM mechanism to certainly be kick in and offer the kind of support that we can do and ought to as a region.
And of course, one of the fundamental elements of the CARICOM relationship has to do with consultation in foreign matters. In external affairs, there should be some consultation and, where possible, some common position with regard to any particular issue which may be brewing at the point in time.
Oh, absolutely. And you see, the duality of what are our common interests in CARICOM is extremely important. The Treaty for Security Assistance, for instance, speaks to the extent to which, as a Caribbean community, we are all committed to the type of stability and security that ensures economic and social development across the member states. So that's a fundamental benchmark. To what extent is the safety, security, economic, and social development on any member state or the region as a whole is part of the interest, the framework of interest that causes the various mechanisms to respond or react to threats to them. And so it's extremely important. We ought not to not ensure that the option of working as a coherent and cohesive regional community is on the foreign policy table at all times.
The Prime Minister, and I'm probably interpreting in my mind what she thought of course, that can't be absolutely true. It can't be true at all. I'm just saying that she came to the conclusion that Trinidad and Tobago's own interest, and as you indicated, self-interest is the dominating element of foreign policy. She came to the conclusion that Trinidad and Tobago's interest is best served as an individual unit, notwithstanding whatever arrangement that this country has with CARICOM.
Well, I mean, you said it in the initial part of your question. All countries pursue their state interests, and the extent to which we collaborate with other countries is particularly tied to how mutual are our state interests in relation to other countries. And that's the value of collaborating. You explore that, you explore the extent to which we have a common interest with other sovereign states, and the arrangements by which we collaborate is informed by those mutual or common interests. Now, as far as Trinidad and Tobago is concerned, there are some complexities that are associated with where we are geographically and otherwise. Similar to Guyana, our relationship with the continental states of Latin America, by proximity, offers a unique blend of state interests that should be part of the foreign policy design and strategy. So, for instance, this country has been plagued with transnational organized crime from continental countries, who are the source countries. The three big issues are human trafficking, narco trafficking, and small arms trafficking, most of which are trafficked from the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. And to the extent that it is important for Trinidad and Tobago to be able to share intelligence with the source country, to anticipate the extent to which that side of the transnational organized criminal enterprise is understood on our side, is extremely important to national security. At the extent to which we work with those source countries and their militaries, their naval powers in joint interdiction is also a very important part of how we organize and defend what is in our best interests. So that those are just two examples of why it is in the best interest of Trinidad and Tobago to keep all of our foreign policy and our foreign relations options on the table. It's extremely important.
Now, the Prime Minister must have concluded, given all that you've said and given all of the possibilities around, that Trinidad and Tobago's best interests those lie with the United States, given our trade arrangement, given the large numbers, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of Trinidadians who have been in the US for decades and so on, must have concluded, let me make it clear that Trinidad and Tobago's interest lies in a far greater degree with the USA than with Venezuela. And this is notwithstanding dragon gas and proximity, etc. How do you respond to that?
Well, the importance of maintaining all of our options on the diplomatic and foreign policy table is a key guide to that question that you're asking. The United States of America and the Republic of China is clearly reshaping the global order, or I would say disorder, of the world today. But between those two powerful countries, they are the largest trading partners. So that the question of defining what is a country's interests and how those interests plays out in different types of relationships with the same foreign country or foreign power is extremely important. So that while these two powerful countries could exercise different levels of competition on the geopolitical space, they are mutually beneficiaries of their trading arrangements that ensures that their economy remains resilient and so on. I think that is an important tenet when we are assessing our foreign policy with any country. What is the framework of enduring interests and values and principles that are important to us? Now, it is not that we should pursue interests with countries that violates important international norms and so on. That's a balancing act. But we can speak to the things that we do not agree with in other countries and still work with them on areas of mutual interest. And that's the complexity that should form the design and pursuit of any country's foreign policy.
Right. Finally, the Prime Minister also brought the Guyana-Venezuela issue into her statement. Whether or not it was thrown in there for some kind of wider interest, or if it is a genuine concern, not in its overall makeup, but rather in the circumstances of the present, i.e., the ships of the United States, the warships, presenting some kind of difficulty for the region.
Yeah, well, let me first say that the US, British, or French naval presence in the Caribbean is nothing new to us. And that has been an important part of regional defense and security for quite a long time. The United States of America has the right to deploy its military assets anywhere in the world that it perceives is in the best interests of its sovereign interests. Again, we're back to the question of defining what is in the interest of a state and how it informs how that state pursues its international relations and relationship with other entities around the world. Now, the question of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, I think should first be established. Our position should be established within the arrangement of CARICOM that I would have explained and we are all quite aware of in the past. I don't know to what extent that would have been explored in this matter. But as far as the question of how we position ourselves in relation to the potentiality of any kind of military invasion into a disputed area or any kind of eventuality like that, it is important in foreign policy to not presume, right? It is important to look at the probability and possibility of a particular outcome and conduct the kind of backdoor diplomacy and resource mobilization and everything else that comes with ensuring that this country's sovereign interests is pursued in whatever is the outcome of things that you do not have control over, right? Now, remember, this is war we are talking about. And war in any part of the world presents us with all kinds of complex challenges. I mean, we're living in a technological age in which we can see firsthand in real time how countries that do not manage the potential of war, how they are affected, and not just the countries who are fighting, but the countries that surround them. And so the complexity of that would suggest and inform that we should ensure that how we pursue our foreign policy avoids the risk of war, avoids the risk of armed conflict as much as is possible. And that's an important part of maintaining all of the options on the table of our foreign policy framework.
Okay. Richard Anthony Lynch, thank you very much for your clinical analysis of the situation. If I were to conclude, my conclusion, not yours, I don't want to get you in trouble. Being a journalist, you're always in trouble, so nothing new. That essentially, that if we are going to make statements one way or the other, there should be one collaboration and real planning and thinking about our best interests in the circumstances, and those essentials should guide what we say. Thank you very much, and I am sure to be calling you at some other point in time on a subject, clearly the subject that you have had a lot of experience in. Thanks again for being with us.
The pleasure is mine. Oliver.
All right, to our listeners and viewers, now we shift and broaden the discussion relating to all of the matters that have been talked about. One of the first things that we want to talk about is our energy interests. As we know, we have talked about the dragon between the US and Venezuela. We are somewhere in the middle of that catching hell. A Calypsonian like PK might put it like that. But seriously, that so we're going to widen the discussion, talking about the interests of the energy interests of Trinidad and Tobago. And I was attracted to this by an article that I read in which one of our guests, Anthony Paul, a well-known energy expert in Trinidad and Tobago, talked about the Manatee field. We hear all the time about dragon, but the Manatee is a different one, where there's a shared resource between the two countries, the Venezuela side, the Trinidad and Tobago side, and all of the matters around it. So let me go to Tony Paul first, but before I do that, we're going to also assess the broader economic elements of it, and of course the political elements of it, which you can't get away from. Just to note that we expect Gregory McGuire to join us at some point in time. He wasn't too certain where he would be at a particular time, but hopefully he will come in soon enough. So let me go to you, Tony Paul. I have done a very, very brief summary of what you've talked about in this report in the newspaper. Give our listeners and our viewers an appreciation of the Manatee field, how we can preserve our relationship with Venezuela in the difficult times, and at some point in the future, hopefully not too far into the future, we can benefit from our portion of the field. Tony Paul.
Thank you very much, Tony, for having me on the show, and thanks for allowing me a chance to explain the situation. The article that you reference is in response to a question I was asked. What are the implications of the current U.S. military presence in the Caribbean, as far as it might affect the Dragon gas field and the Manatee gas field development, and of course, potentially Trinidad and Tobago's future gas developments? You're speaking about Manatee, but let me just give a little distinction between the two. The Dragon gas field is one of many gas fields that are entirely in Venezuelan territory and not in Trinidad territory at all. So that means our interest there is get Venezuelan gas to come to Trinidad to process and add value. On the other hand, the Manatee field is next door to a field in Venezuela called the Loran field. Now, let me explain what a field means. A field is a geographical area where oil assets developed, meaning infrastructure is put in place, wells are drilled to produce it. And that field area is defined by the geography and the ability to use and reuse those assets so that they can get the most efficient development. Now, a field geologically may comprise one or more reservoirs. A reservoir is an underground body that contains oil or gas or both. And any field may have multiple reservoirs, distinct from each other, not connected to each other. In the case of oil fields that are cross boundaries, and this applies to international boundaries, as well as in the case of Trinidad, for instance, licensed boundaries. So, we have licensed areas onshore and offshore. And the geology or the rock structure doesn't follow man's surface line drawings. So if a field crosses a border, it is in the interests of the operators on both sides to come together and come up with a plan to develop it most efficiently. Now, that will mean where you put the wells, where you put the infrastructure, if it's a platform, where you put pipelines, how big you size it, and so on. Now, as I mentioned, in a field, there may be multiple reservoirs. A reservoir might be entirely on one side of the border or another, or it might straddle a border, in which case the companies or the countries in this case will decide what is the best place to develop this from, where's the best place to place the wells, how many wells, and what rates, and so on. In the case of Manatee, now we know Manatee as the name of the field that was discovered in Trinidad. On the other side of the border is the Loran field. And together, that complex is called the Loran-Manatee field. And in the recent past, Trinidad and Tobago, in the past, Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela agreed to develop these two as a unit. In other words, to unitize them and develop them concurrently. In unitization, both parties agree to what's under the ground, how much each party has rights to, and based on that proportion of rights, they will allocate both the costs and the expenditure to develop and produce it, and the allocation of production. So it's a shared asset eventually, operated by some party who may be chosen by one or other, or a joint party. In the case,
just before you go on, it puzzles me, and I suppose some of our listeners and viewers. How do you divide something like grass that is swirling around? It's not a block of gold that you could cut in half or cut in some kind of proportion. How do you begin to assess what quantity is on each of the sides?
Right. So fortunately, these fluids, oil, gas, and water underground, are constrained within reservoirs. A reservoir, essentially, in Trinidad's case, is a body of sand that's under the earth, that's buried by shale, a finer material that keeps it from the fluid from coming out. So it's a body underground that's constrained physically. When you put a well in it, that well bore allows the fluids to flow out, and that's when you produce it. So the question you're asking really is, how do I know what's where? Yeah. And that's where geophysical data is collected above the ground to image what's below ground. The most common one we use in getting accurate information is known as the seismic method, which essentially is like an acoustic wave, almost like an ultrasound, sending waves into the ground, and the reflection of those waves are captured and measured on the surface, and then those waves are converted into an image. It gives us a sense of how deep things are, what shape they have, and in cases now, what kinds of fluids are in there. And because rocks have physical properties, the essential property we use in this is the density of the rock. Okay. Of course, a rock with gas will be less dense than a rock with oil or water, because gas is less dense. So those are the things we use, and those techniques allow us to to constrain the dimensions and locations of those reservoirs. I hope that explains it.
Yeah, I think novices like myself have a little better understanding of, the reservoir example. You have one reservoir on one side, and I suppose if the reservoir itself crosses the boundary, there is some way of demarcating which is which. So our viewers, our listeners have got, and myself have got something of an appreciation of it. Now, the next question is, and the critical question, how will what is happening in the Caribbean, or what is about to happen, or what can happen, impact on our accessing that field? If things turn out differently, it can be years into the future. If it is another way, it can be not too long again. How do we come to terms with such possibilities?
Sure. Well, of course, again, just for reference sake, the Dragon field we know is parked because of the sanctions that are in place. That's entirely in Venezuela's side. So there's nothing that has changed with the position at the moment. On the other hand, the Manatee field and the Loran field were meant to be unitized. With the sanctions, a decision was taken some time ago, not too long ago, to separate them to an extent. In other words, on the Trinidad side, the operator, Shell, would produce those reservoirs within the Manatee field that lie entirely within Trinidad and Tobago's jurisdiction and do not straddle the Venezuelan border, which means it'll be a partial development of the complex until such time as the rest of it can be brought on, hopefully in the not too long future. Now, of course, what will happen is that couple of things have to change. One, of course, we know the geopolitics, and of course the economics, and they're not disconnected. So the most we can do is wait. In any case, until this recent development, that was the case. We were going to develop it and wait till the geopolitics changed.
Right. Okay. So Professor Patrick Watson, who we know as an economist and somebody who comments on geopolitical matters all around the world and so on, looking into what can happen, Professor Watson, given the circumstances that we're in, that I've outlined, the 3 warships coming into the region. There was a contest by the United States with regard to President Maduro, whether he's legally, officially in office, and they have a different view on all of that. And the concern is that more than the Americans are thinking about the drug cartels, they're really after to make a statement or even more about Venezuelan President Maduro. Your take of, your sense of all of that.
All right. Let me start by saying that the U.S. is very much in the habit of raising one issue while the true reason is something else. They have done this over and over again and have used such reasons as pretext for interference in countries. The U.S. is the most interfering country on the face of the earth and probably the most interfering country in history. And that is what we have before us. The U.S. has never made a secret since Chavez came into office that they wanted regime change in Venezuela. And everything that they have done, included up to today, is in keeping with that. Of course, they give us basket to hold about narco trafficking and so on. And those who wish to hold on to that, to participate in the dupery, because this is what it is, have held on to it, and people have gone for it. When the true reason, for obvious reasons, and it's a historical continuation of what has been happening, the U.S. is interested in regime change in Venezuela, and that is what they are going after. They have
before you continue, give our listeners and our viewers your take on why regime change, if that is what the Americans are after.
For one, the regime in power is not very friendly to Washington, and that has been since Chavez has come into office. There is a looking outward to countries like India, Iran, China, and others, Cuba, and others of that ilk. Venezuela is very likely, and it's already in a way flirting with the idea of becoming a member of BRICS. Of course, the B in BRICS is for Brazil, R is for Russia, and I is for India, C is for China, and S is for South Africa. That is where they are looking. And BRICS is a direct challenge to US hegemony all over the world, including the hegemony of the US dollar, and including the use of Venezuela's oil, which now becomes available to the BRICS nations and for trading with them, China, because there's an embargo, as you very well know, by the US on Venezuelan oil. Venezuela has a lot of trouble selling its oil. So Venezuela is not itself a producer of narcotics, although it is a transshipment point for narcotics that is well known. So this is the basket that the US has given the region to hold, and unfortunately, some of us have held on to it. And worse than that, rather than pronounce on our neutrality, or at least something like that, even how stupid it may sound, we in Trinidad and Tobago, our government has rushed to take a side in the matter, putting us in harm's way, clearly in harm's way, because we have offered landing space to a foreign aggressor in the region on the basis of something that was not at all raised in the whole incident about interfering with Guyana. So that's another red herring that was introduced to give us a prop to hold on to. And a lot of people are repeating this Guyana nonsense. This was not raised at all. This does not mean that Guyana and Venezuela do not have issues. That is a very well-known fact. I'm not going to go into that about who is right or who is wrong and so on, but there are issues. But that did not come up in the current context. What the flotilla, the Armada, is about coming into the region because it wants to deal with narco trafficking, when the reality is they want to deal with the Maduro regime. Now, my own feeling is that this may only be a lot of saber rattling, because I think Donald Trump is now in a position where he's trying to save face for all the foolishness that he has been doing in Ukraine, and in particular what he has been doing domestically with ICE and all these kinds of things. And there's a growing resistance by the American people. Openly, 2 governors already, at least 2 that I know of, have already spoken out against Donald Trump and have made it known that they are not participating in his foolishness. And of course, he has threatened to deal with them in other ways. So this could really be a sideshow by the Americans. I don't know, but it's a very, very dangerous sideshow, because what it has done in the context of Trinidad and Tobago anyway is to make the position of the government of Trinidad and Tobago known to Venezuela, to the United States, and to the rest of the world, that we are here and all ready to accept a foreign aggressor on our soil, ostensibly to deal with protecting Guyana, when the true reason behind all of this. Incidentally, I should remind people about the history of Guyana and Venezuela. In the 1950s, when Cheddi Jagan, who was accused of being a communist, was elected in Guyana, the US not only recognized the rights of Venezuela, but actively participated in the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Cheddi Jagan in Guyana. And at that time,
supported by the British also.
Yes, of course, but the Americans were the ones doing the thing here. Yeah. So we have that history where they have already interfered in the politics, in the life of Guyana, caused a lot of turmoil. I mean, I am old enough to remember the calypsos by Sparrow and all these kinds of things, but well, it was British Guyana in those days, but how the whole of BG burned down and all this kind of thing. And many people were affected by this. This was a traumatic experience for the Guyanese
All right,
people.
so let me put you on to a different kind of question. You've dealt with the geopolitics of it and the international, historical international presence and disposition of the United States. Coming from the Trinidad and Tobago perspective, where our interests, our economic interests, so you put on your hat as an economist now, never leaving the politics too far behind you. Trinidad and Tobago's interest may be in the area of association with the United States, and this is notwithstanding Manatee and Dragon and all of that.
All that is true. America, the USA, and Venezuela are countries with which we are friendly. We are friendly with both these countries. That is the reality. So we do have it's a bit awkward that two friends should be fighting and we have to see how best we can dance in between. What we must not do is pick a side. And that is exactly what we have done in this matter. And in my view, we have picked the wrong side because you've chosen the side of the aggressor. And I know self-interest is important. And we have family in America. I have family in the United States of America. We have all kinds of connections. It's our biggest trading partner, and we have to be very careful how we deal with them. But especially under the current administration, there's no guarantee that you're going to get anything. Because Modi danced with Trump. And what did Trump do? Turn around and put what they call it, tariffs on Indian goods. There is no predicting what this man will do. So yes, we do have to think about our relationship with the big Satan in the north. I have no doubt about that. As much as I have my issues with them, I know that we cannot do much without dealing with the great Satan. I have no doubt about that, and I am not going to fool myself.
Even if you call him Satan.
Yeah. Well, that's a term that was given to him by the Ayatollah Khomeini, the great Satan. And yes, it is not something that we want to do. We have friendly relations with the United States of America. We have friendly relations with the American people. I am a supporter of American athletes and the American football team and so on. I always I don't turn against them because they're the United States of America. That is not true. We have good relations with the US, and we have to find a way. The other countries in the Caribbean have the same issue, but they don't get up and tell a man that he has the right to come and land and use our place as a base. That is, I don't want to use sexual terminology, but that's the only thing I could think about. That is not what you do in a context like that. That's prostituting yourself now. Because what you deal with it diplomatically. You try your best. You make sure you tell people, well, look, I really I'm hoping that this. You say all the platitudes that you wish, okay, about you hope this thing gets resolved in an amicable manner, etc. You say all what you need to say, but you do not get involved in that in that bacchanal, and you certainly don't agree to use your country as a base for harboring an aggressive power in the region against another friendly nation.
All right. So here what we're going to take a break now and come back to the discussion. And let me hear what Tony Paul thinks of all of this in terms of his own focus, which is on the gas under the water and how we can make best use of it. So, Charlo, we take a break for the moment and we come back to the discussion.
Nobody, when you're ready to think of it, nobody wins a war. The brutal clash of ideologies, carnage and social anarchy, and life reduced to pitiful dimension. The falling back of progress and growth.
Join me, Brother David Muhammad, every Tuesday from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. here on New Era TT Radio, Net Radio, Powerful Radio. Join me to hear knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. Tuesdays, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. here on New Era TT Radio, Net Radio.
S&H Rumbox, 137 Western Main Road, St. James, for all your retail and wholesale needs for alcohol and non-alcoholic beverages. Call us at 686-0599 or visit us at 137 Western Main Road, St. James. S&H Rumbox, drinking out of the box.
CRS Calypso Productions presents Revival the Concert 5, paying tribute to two Calypso icons, Maestro and Brother Valentino, happening on Saturday 30th August 2025. Special performance by none other than Brother Valentino himself. Featured performers will be King Luther, Cardinal, Exposer, Kinte, Emba, Hamedula, Lady Listra, Roxy Singh, Brother Mac, Travis the Artist, Tall Blacks, The Messenger, and Sheldon Nugget. Also DJ Cool Moody and more. Taking place at Pleasantville Community Center. Early bird tickets are $150 until the 20th of July. Then it's $200. Time is from 8 p.m. Tickets available at Sion's, Royal Road, and Ateliers by the Park. Or contact 343-5182 or 492-1066. You don't want to miss this one.
Advertise with us on New Era TT Radio, the fastest growing streaming platform for talk in Trinidad and Tobago. Audio and video ads welcome. Elevate your brand with us. Connect with us at newerattradio@yahoo.com or call us at 299-5156. Now what are you waiting for?
Bold discussions, the hottest topics, and some tracks to keep you moving. The Drive Time Exchange on Net Radio, taking you above and beyond.
As long as the quest for wealth and power still live in the hearts of man, brother, you all will go on. It cannot be won. No, the war will go on. It cannot be won.
All right, everybody. So we are back inside of the Drive Time Exchange in the second hour. So, Tony, yeah, it's back to you. I have not seen your other guests as yet.
Okay, good. We hope that he comes in at some point in time. He said he was on the road, and when he gets a clearance, he can come in. We're talking about Gregory McGuire, who looks at the economics of oil and gas for Trinidad and Tobago. Let me go to Anthony Paul. Is there some kind of danger, or put it another way, is there some possibilities that out of the complexity of the politics, the geopolitics, as well described by Patrick Watson, I suppose I want to ask it in a very human kind of way, that we have these resources, both sides, in fact all sides, including the United States, which of course will benefit in the circumstances. Can we afford, all of us, to allow this possibility of gas, which is on oil and gas perhaps under the ground, and leave it there while we continue to argue about politics and military matters and so on?
Tony, there's a saying, never let a good crisis waste. Trinidad and Tobago has, in my view, as a geologist, a former director of geology and geophysics at the Ministry of Energy, former exploration manager at Amoco and BP, I believe there's a whole lot more of oil and gas to be found in Trinidad and Tobago if we were to put our efforts in that direction. Now, the Exxon coming on board gives a sense of the confidence that others may have in our basins that we may not have projected internationally. I believe there's similar opportunities onshore in Trinidad, in the Gulf of Paria, and in the shallow water of the East Coast as well, right? because of new technology developed over time, the ability to drill much deeper and produce much deeper reservoirs than we have in the past. And potentially there's a lot of oil as well, not just gas. And make no mistake, Exxon isn't coming to Trinidad as really water for oil, for gas, sorry. It is oil. It's the same kind of trend they're following from Guyana. So if we think about that and say, fine, we've been distracted or we've been focused entirely on the Venezuelan gas in the recent past. Let's use this hiatus, this lacuna, to focus on our own assets and put our minds and people to work on those and find more of that. Now, we know the last time we had, or one of the times we had a big crisis in oil and gas production and prices back in the 80s, what we did is brought on the small marginal fields by introducing small players to develop those because their economic models made those profitable to them. We do have smaller fields, and we see a constant churning of the bigger companies, BP, Woodside, selling down their assets to small companies. But for some reason, they're only selling them to foreign small companies. We're not seeing the locals get a chance to participate. That's the one thing that really concerns me because, Tony, you may know this, but every time an oil company drills or does seismic data, that money is banked as money spent. And then they sell the oil, and from the revenues of the oil, our oil, they recover those costs. So effectively, we pay all those costs. Not only do they charge us for the actual cost spent, they actually add an administration fee on top of that. And if they borrow money, they add interest on that. And we pay that. So we are paying for these assets. It's because of that, our law has a clause that at the end of a license, the assets will revert to the state. Not only that, the company, the operator, has an obligation to maintain these assets in an operable state. So when the license expires, the state can take it over and run it, if it so wishes, or divest it to a third party if it so wishes. There's another reason for that. The reason that we have Petrotrin and our heritage is that in the 1960s, both BP and Shell left because they didn't think the assets were any longer commercial. So what we had to do is find a way to get the oil that was out to the ground still flowing, to get the people who were trained to do that work still employed, to get the equipment that had been paid for to be working. And we created those companies. So think about this, Tony. We've seen these companies, same companies, divesting assets of diminishing value. And instead of using the companies we built in the 70s and 80s and to get them involved, you don't see any participation of the state company in those assets, do you? Mm-hmm. And guess what's even more worrisome is that when these assets are sold to companies like Perenco, none of the revenue from that sale, none of the profit benefits the state, who, as I said before, had paid for it. So we paid for it through cost recovery. Because the Petroleum Taxes Act only taxes revenue on sale of oil and gas, when they sell assets, we get no revenue, even though the selling assets we paid for. Mm-hmm. That is one of the many flaws in our tax system that causes us to bleed billions every year.
Okay, but let me come back to the question. And now that you've brought in the multinational corporations, they are the ones, if a government driven by politics and geopolitics and all kinds, even personal concerns, may be looking in that direction and focused on getting its way in the political tussle. The corporations, the multinationals, they are not so much interested in that, but to take the resources out of the ground. And my question is this: can the politics continue to rule the situation and without the economics making a pathway into the situation? And we're going to ask Patrick Watson about that also. But let me ask you first, Tony Paul.
No, for sure. I mean, the point I was making is that we must focus our efforts on the economics, and this lacuna gives us a chance to do that. And that is part of that. The oil companies, as the earlier speaker said, they serve their interests, and their interest is in making money for their shareholders. So we have to understand how their role in Trinidad can help them do that, and how therefore we can, in doing that, they can help our interests. So as we've seen in other opportunities, both in Trinidad and in Guyana, the country's governments believe that a big multinational company has the support of its government because of the impact it has on their host government's economy. And therefore, should there be any challenges, then that country will come to their support.
Patrick Watson.
I have absolutely no problem, and largely based on our own history, in dealing with ExxonMobil or anybody. I would have preferred that we didn't have to go along that line, because it never really works totally in our interest. The big beneficiary of our oil in Trinidad and Tobago has always been the multinationals, with Shell, Texaco, BP, and it continues to be at this point in time BP. BP is the big winner in our energy sector. And yes, we benefit, and a lot of people don't know this. We benefit largely from the rents, from the dividends that BP pays to us for shipping out the oil out of Galeota and the gas and so on. So it would have been nice if that were not the case, but that is how it is, and we probably can't do anything about that in the short to medium term. Barring, of course, doing something ridiculous and then running afoul of Uncle Sam even further. So we have to go along with them. The reality.
And my question is, can they, the multinational corporations, more interested in making their dollar than getting involved in geopolitics? Of course, there is a connection there somewhere. And can these corporations say to the American government and to the Venezuelan government, look, there is a resource that is waiting to be explored. Let us get on with this and leave the politics behind.
Yes, they can do that, but there are other issues involved, certainly in the case of Venezuela. We and Guyana are not going to have that problem. We have a history, certainly in the case of Trinidad and Tobago. Guyana is new in the business of facilitating American oil companies, British oil companies, as well, going way back from the time oil was first discovered in Trinidad and Tobago. That is not that I'm not telling people anything new here. So I don't think that they have to sell that point anymore. Entering into a relationship with the Trinidad and Tobago government is not something that is going to worry the government of the United States of America or any Western government for that matter. I am simply saying that what we have to do, and I'm following up on the point that Tony Paul made, is to make sure that we get the best deal out of it. I mean, remember, all of this goes back to Arthur Lewis. You remember what people incorrectly called industrialization by invitation, which is the whole idea of monetizing your resources by bringing foreign investors. And in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, that includes oil. And of course, in the other countries, there are other sectors like tourism and so on that have been monetized using the foreign. But that doesn't mean that sandals cannot come into being, as has happened in the case of Jamaica. So what we tried with Petrotrin, and Petrotrin was an abysmal failure for all kinds of reasons. And when they eventually shut it down, it was because it was wasting a lot of money. It had entered into an agreements that was running us into serious debt. So the conventional ones like BP and of course ExxonMobil, and Shell, we have now re-entered into an arrangement with Shell. We even have a Steelman once again. Those of you who are old enough to remember that Invaders, in the days of Henry Man, it was called
Shell Invaders,
and that's what it is now. So and so we have a relationship with all of these. We have a history with these oil companies, and now in the case of Exxon, a new one. Well, not true, because Esso used to be here in the old days as well. So yes, we have to go along with them. What we have to do is to ensure that we get the best deal. What we don't know, and because they are skilled negotiators and they know how to wring the last penny out of you, and so that's what they pay people to do that. They pay people to do that, and of course they are not averse. I'm not saying this will happen in the case of Trinidad and Tobago. They are not averse to using slush funds. In fact, so many of them have noted slush funds to pay off state officials and so on, so that they pay $1 and get away with 10. That is not an unusual thing. What we have to do is make sure that does not happen, and for whatever it's worth, we get the best possible deal out of it, bearing in mind that they must also get their share of the pie, because that's the rule. That's the rule.
Okay, so let me go to the poll now to find out, given the politics being played out in the Caribbean Sea and the movement from one to the other, and talk about gangsters and cartels and all of that. What should Trinidad and Tobago? What are our best options with regard not to the politics? That will work itself out. But how do we prepare to get to a position when all of this is finished, or at least subsided for a moment, to deal with what we want out of Venezuela in our arrangements with them?
Interesting question, Tony. But before I get to that, let me give you an example of how the economics dominates geopolitics. You said in your conversation with the earlier guest that Venezuelan oil is sanctioned, and by that we take it to mean that it's not flowing anywhere except illicitly. Do you know that Chevron still imports into the US oil every single day from Venezuela? Large amounts. Even though they were stopped for a while, that continued. And there's a good reason for that. One, Venezuela is a big asset for Chevron, which is a major corporation in the US. And as we know, the oil companies are major lobbyists in Washington, D.C. Not only that, the US refineries in the Gulf of Mexico were all built before and during the 70s, and all depended on heavier crude, pre-shale crude. And they're designed to produce products for the US market, gasoline, diesel, and so on. Now, you know that a big bellwether for economics in the US is the cost of gasoline. You know that, as Bill Clinton famously said, or I forget who it was, is the economics, right, dummy? So if the gasoline prices will go up, that puts politicians in danger. Now, the shale oil, always abundant, is very expensive to produce. Not only that, it doesn't produce the mix of products that the US market needs. So the US needs to import heavier crude to blend it with its own indigenous crude. That used to come largely from Venezuela. When the Venezuelan sanctions were put on, that market switched to Russia. And then Russia was sanctioned. So there isn't another reliable, cheap source of that kind of crude easily accessible into the US Gulf Coast. So Venezuelan crude was still coming in spite of the geopolitics because of the economics, right? So having said that, the question you asked is what should Trinidad do to prepare? We should be very thoughtful about the opportunities available to us. Where is the gas and oil going to come from? How are we going to monetize those? How do we find them? Dragon and Manatee and those fields are the tip of the iceberg, in my view, for the potential for gas on the Venezuelan side of the border. I mentioned earlier there's some smaller fields and some potentially large fields in Trinidad untapped by lack of technology and drilling that wasn't available to us before. So I think we should focus our efforts on finding those opportunities, building the economic case, and using that economic case to then drive our international relations and our geopolitics. As everything else, economics drives, geopolitics. So I would say put our minds and experience to work, which, to be fair, for at least in my view, looking on in the last couple of decades, we have not been doing that. In my view, we've been sailing along on the winds of the company's success, and we haven't really taken this industry by in hand and said, let's steer this in the direction we want to go. And that's why we've been declining without any sign of it leveling off, far less improving. Those are my quick thoughts on that, Tony.
Yeah. Patrick Watson, you wanted to make a comment there.
Yeah, let me just quickly, and that's precisely the point. We have not tried to take this thing and to lead it in the direction that best suits us. We have surrendered too willingly. Not all the time, I mean, we have had some gains like things like the supplemental petroleum tax and so on, but we are always willing to back down on these things. And sometimes we have no choice because the situation is so bad. When I was a child, and my father worked in the oil field, we used to be told that production was 150,000 barrels a day. That's no longer the case. We are producing close to 50,000 now and declining. So we are going to be held by the proverbial balls, even with greater Panama song by David Rudder. Yeah. And so that's the kind of thing. You don't want that to happen. You don't want a modern O'Halloran running away with half the oil money that we make.
Let me ask you something, Professor Watson. Given what the Prime Minister has said and open the arms of Trinidad and Tobago, welcoming and so on, can that negatively impact on us into the future? Of course, you have to put into context what happens in Venezuela. I noticed one of the Venezuelan ministers saying this morning that he's really put out by the statement.
He's pissed off, and correctly so too. I
didn't want to go that far. So I am asking that, can that harm us into the future? And I know that will take into consideration what happens between Maduro and Trump and all the politics.
Yes, I don't. If this thing comes to naught, for instance, if the US just comes in and there's really a lot of brave danger and nothing more, a lot of saber rattling and so on, and then they pull away. That is not going to leave us in good stead with our Venezuelan neighbors. Now, I hope that the history of our cordial relations over time will serve as a good enough buffer to make us be not put in the bad light. Because I have always said, people who think that my criticism of the PNM is that they were putting too many eggs in the dragon basket. That it's not that the dragon basket we must not go at it. We have to. It was worth the shot. But to the extent that we have already paid a lot of money to Venezuela, and in fact some people are now asking for it to be returned and so on, and that of course is not going to happen. We are in a position where we are likely to lose the favor of the Venezuelan authorities with Dragon, and I don't think that is something that we want. Mm-hmm. I don't think we will benefit from a souring of relations, and what has happened in recent times has done nothing to improve relations between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela.
Mm-hmm. But then again, Tony Paul, we come back to what's in our best interest. The Venezuelans might not like what our Prime Minister has done at this point in time, and when they get over that hurt and pain and so on, and they look at the possibilities for the processing of their gas and their oil and whatever, they may say, okay, we forgive you, and let us hold hands and do the economic thing going forward.
Which is the sensible thing to do. That's the sensible thing to do. But sometimes people are not very sensible.
No, you're right. I mean, brothers and sisters fall out, neighbors fall out. But as Professor Watson says, sensible people will make up. It's not only in Trinidad's interest to produce that gas. It's also in Venezuela's interest to produce that gas. Venezuela has a lot of natural gas, and Venezuela's industry has not monetized natural gas in the way we have. Of course, they produce oil, and a barrel of oil is worth a lot more than equivalent in gas in terms of what it gets in per dollar spent in getting it out of the ground. So for that reason, Venezuela hasn't had it, and we use natural gas for electricity, Most of Venezuela's electricity comes from hydro power. So, but they have had an interest in developing their gas industry. Trinidad would be a very good place to start. Not only because we have the infrastructure in place, because it's very difficult for them to put infrastructure near those gas fields. It's remote areas. So it's still in Venezuelan interest. So it's how do we, after this, find a way to shake hands and make up and get both sides' interests working? And it can be done. As the professor said, we had decades of very good relationships. Not only cordial, but mutually beneficial relationships. Both parties bending over backwards to facilitate each other over years. I worked on the Trinidad and Venezuela boundary treaty negotiations. And during those negotiations, from those of you who may know, the negotiations of maritime boundaries are typically based on the UN Convention for the Law of the Sea, which uses what is called a median line between the coastlines of neighboring or adjacent states. Venezuela never signed the Convention for the Law of the Sea because it would cause them problems with Colombia. However, they did agree to use those provisions in our negotiations. Not only that, when we were negotiating the line, we realized that one of our discovered gas fields, the Capoc field, was actually south of the median line. In other words, it would have belonged to Venezuela. But they were accommodating, and they allowed us to put the line south of Capoc to retain that gas field. When we looked at the Columbus Channel, the median line there, we moved it slightly north in exchange. But in return, they allowed our fishermen to continue fishing on their side of the border, including in their riverine inland waterways, which they don't allow Venezuelan fisherfolk to do. So they were quite accommodating in that respect. And we've had many incidents of Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela collaborating in ways like that. So we've had good relationships, and I'm sure that people around who remember those things, who can come back and shake hands and say, yes, we didn't agree on these things. But, and this is an important but, as the professor said and the earlier guest said, Trinidad and Tobago is also a good neighbor with Guyana. And there's a serious issue there. So we have to see how best we can play, hopefully, a mediator, if we can. We've done that in the past. And how we can get both parties to come out to mutually benefit from the resources available to them and not have it fall out of hand.
I want to come back to that on a question of unity or disunity within CARICOM in these matters, as I presume I have heard that there are some discussions, technical discussions, which have started and going on with regard to the whole business of CARICOM developing a position. But I'm going to come back to that in a moment. I want both of you to answer to a question which a lot of people don't fully understand. Why should the United States have a say in terms of whether Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela cooperate in whatever production that is possible? Let me hear both of you on that question. So, in other words, why should we, bother with the Americans and go on to Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago, working their way through the agreements?
Let me go first on that. I mean, the answer is kind of obvious. You're dealing with a very, very powerful neighbor who could do you a lot of harm. I mean, even they're doing harm to Venezuela. The sanctions are sufficient. They do a lot of harm to Cuba. Up to now, the embargo on Cuba is hurting them very, 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 very badly. You don't want to run afoul of the United States, and they begin sanctioning not just you. They then sanction individuals like myself, and they have done to a minister. I think it's in Antigua. Or one of these countries. That's how bad it is becoming in the United States of America now, because they're big and they're bad and they Congo as my mother used to say, and they can't do you harm. So to the extent that you want to deal with your gas in the Dragon Field, but you are not allowed to sell it anywhere, you're going to have trouble. And if under the Biden administration, they seem to be going in the direction of allowing us to go with the drug. With Trump and in particular Rubio, all right, who seems to have all kinds of concerns and about the country of his parents' birth and so on. We simply have to go along and bear in mind what the US is doing. We cannot, because they are our biggest trading partner and they buy a lot of stuff from us, and they don't need to buy a lot of stuff from us. And they will continue to buy what they wish, but if they put us on a blacklist, or if in the case of Trump they triple the tariffs on us as is happening now, we're going to be in some serious trouble. So the answer to that is simple. They are bigger than us, they are stronger than us. We have to be mindful of the power that they wield. And the reason why nothing has been happening is because they have said it will not happen. And that's why it's not happening. It's as simple as that. Because they have the power to do so.
Tony Paul, is there a question which has been raised about the use of the US currency in any arrangement, that whatever the arrangement is between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela? And of course, we spoke a moment ago about the BRICS coming into developing their own currency. But for the moment, is the currency, the use of the US currency in the arrangements between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela an issue?
To get back to the first question you asked, the professor, I mean, using cricket terminology, Tony, I know you're a fan of that. Trinidad and Tobago is a small player, and we have to know to stay in our crease. We really shouldn't step out and try to disturb a status quo that we really can't influence. In this case, Trinidad and Tobago depends on the United States for so much trade that to shake that monetary arrangement or those payment systems could have a lot of significant impacts for it, especially if it doesn't appear to be in the United States' interest. So I think, to use another cricket term, I think I will leave that one alone. Rather than try to get into unraveling that, whether or not we go into that. That whole movement away from the US dollar, away from the petrodollar, as it were, got some impetus when the Saudis made some noises in that direction. But that quieted down very quickly. And they are the biggest influencer of that at the moment. But that is certainly one of the interesting things that the BRICS countries are looking at. Of course, our countries are subject to sanctions. The biggest weapon in the sanctions regime is the access to the US dollars. And of course, the biggest threat to the United States that they will defend is exactly that, the interest of that. So Trinidad and Tobago really is cockroach and fowl fried in that one.
That's the expression.
Anything on the currency business, of course, with the US concerned, and Trump has made an argument about the BRICS attempting to develop their own trading currency amongst them.
Yes,
is the currency business in the way also.
Yes, I know you have a background in history, Tony, and empires rise and empires fall. And the US empire is clearly falling. And one of the biggest things it has in its favor is the dollar that is so widely used. Any attempt to stay away from the US dollar is viewed with great displeasure by the United States of America. And the BRICS arrangement is an attempt in all circumstances to avoid the use of the US dollar. That is not going to be easy to do, but it is being done. The Chinese currency is a fairly well-known currency now. It's getting stronger and stronger given what China, because that's what makes a currency good, how well you export. That is what makes your currency
what you're backing it with.
A valid one. And the US dollar is under serious threat. Bretton Woods is what in a way has been keeping it alive over the years. And what you have happening is that the US is a heavily indebted country in terms of its own currency, and that does not work in favor of the US dollar. So it's not going to be very hard when push comes to shove, to push the US dollar out of the thing. But they are going to fight that tooth and nail. That is not going to happen. They will probably go to war on it. Many people think that Gaddafi was assassinated because, I don't know if you heard some of these stories, because he was trying to work towards what they will call, let's call it an African dollar, and so on. And that is why all of a sudden he became the big pariah again, because he was always a big pariah, but he had settled down. And then they just up and not just they assassinated him and turned Libya into the Stone Age. That's what they did. And that is the kind of measures that a failing and falling empire will do to keep itself. Very few empires have quietly eclipsed themselves.
Subsided. Okay, so Tony Paul and Patrick Watson, we are at a stage where, we might be in a difficult situation because of the statement, but nevertheless, that's one statement. However critically bad we think it was, and we heard from the diplomatic expert on that matter. We still have to go forward as a country. We are in the middle of it. I think we are closest, and not I think we are, well, if you talk about Guyana and Suriname on the continent itself, but out in the Caribbean Sea, we are the closest to the most countries in terms of, if we think about the war vessels as part of the United States of America, you have them, and then you have the on-land Venezuela. How do we weave our way outside of that in the context of your concern with regard to the energy resources?
Certainly, I think the professor said it before, and I think we all recognize that the diplomat earlier on said, we should understand clearly what our interests are primarily, then what our mutual interests are with the parties in our neighborhood, and then in the global space, and find some kind of balance so that we don't compromise our citizens' benefits, interests, but don't put ourselves in danger. I think that's the most important thing, not only danger from military perspective, but from economic perspective down the road. So getting that balance right is basically what diplomacy is about. And to me, that is what is needed.
All right, before we go on, sorry, before you come in, before we go on, Charlo, if there are callers, listeners, viewers who want to enter the discussion, perhaps you could give them the number so that they can choose to if they want. I'm going to come back to the speakers in a moment. You go ahead, Charlo.
Okay, no problem. Thanks very much, Tony. So, people, you're listening and you're tuned in, you're logged in. We have some people on the message board also. So, you can get involved in the conversation. Give us a call, 281-1315. That's 281-1315. You can regular call us or you can WhatsApp call us. Just call us. All right, so Tony, back to you.
Yeah, thanks. Patrick Watson, you wanted to say something on the...
Yes, I think one of the things that this has made very clear to me, it's true, is that our diplomacy is not very good. It's not very good at all. And this is a shame because we have an Institute of International Relations that was intended to train people for that purpose. And this requires a lot of skill. This requires the skill of a Molotov. I mean, Molotov who negotiated with von Ribbentrop and so on. You need that kind of skill. And
but on the other side, Patrick Watson, CARICOM as a region has a long history of successful diplomacy. Some people describe it as fighting above our weight all the time.
No, and I agree. And that is why, if it's one thing that we have when we band together, is that we have a collective wisdom. That comment that was made by our Prime Minister that CARICOM has failed a long time ago, all of that may be true. But to the extent that the one thing that it could be useful for is a collective effort in dealing with things, of sharing common wisdom, and so you don't abandon these things like that. And we cannot, we just can't go it alone, because we find ourselves in serious difficulty. And to the extent that we lack the diplomatic weight, that's what the gravitas on the ground. Maybe the government is too new to, and is led by the people in charge and neophytes at this point in time. We may not be able to do this thing properly, but this required careful and calculated diplomacy, because it is dancing between us ourselves, our neighbor Venezuela, our neighbor Guyana, and our neighbor to the north, the United States of America. That is not an easy dance to perform, but it is required to be performed. You see? And what you don't do is cut through the Gordian knot and say, I'm coming down on the side of the United States of America. That's what you don't do. You see?
Right. As our first guest, Richard Anthony Lynch, made it clear, is that a lot of thinking, a lot of analysis has to go into the diplomacy rather than shooting off on a political statement, because you're driven in some kind of way to that. To CARICOM now, we know that there are differences, and Prime Minister Kamala Persad-Bissessar has expressed one of those differences among CARICOM states. And we have the known position of the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Ralph Gonsalves, and if we remember, he talked about, or he held was it last year or a year before, an attempt to bring Guyana and Venezuela together. And Ralph Gonsalves has made his position known over the years. Can those things be a difficult thing for CARICOM to cross, a difficult hurdle for CARICOM to cross? Tony Paul.
Well, I think there was also the Bridgetown Accord, if I recollect properly, and that was Prime Minister Motley kind of led that, and that led to some calming of and some agreements in the way forward. So I think yes, there are ways that CARICOM can get involved. I think both parties want a smoothing of the waters, and if we can offer that neutral ground, or that but again, it comes back to keeping that neutrality, keeping that open-mindedness, keeping an ability to listen to both sides and not jump to a conclusion without hearing the others. So I think, yes, that opportunity still arises. I mean, in the past, Trinidad and Tobago played that role with the Chaguaramas Agreement in the 1980s, I think it was. So we played that role. One of the concerns that people don't seem to be addressing is people think that a change in regime in Venezuela will make an easing of the Guyana-Venezuela boundary issue.
Not at all.
In truth and in fact, the right-wing governments in Venezuela have been much more hawkish about that territory traditionally.
This is in the Venezuelan DNA. I don't know when people are going to understand that. This is not something that is limited to Maduro or anything like that. That is not going to stop. Anyway, sorry.
So Eric Williams did get President Chavez to calm things down and stop any discussion about it for a couple of decades. So it is.
The fact that it has lasted 100 years plus means that it goes beyond any particular regime in an office at any point in time.
Yeah, it's only raised its head, I think, because of the scale of resources that have been announced and as discovered, and that has made it. And not only that, Venezuela has not had a love affair with ExxonMobil in the past decades, given the amount of money you had to pay out for resources or assets that were seized through court verdicts in the United States. So it's a difficult situation. It will not be ended easily, but they will take some credible, neutral parties to help calm things down. And that CARICOM had played that role in the past, and I think we still can do it.
What of the decision that comes out of the International Court, one way or the other? Will that be a solution? Both of you.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Patrick. Sorry.
No, I don't know if the International Court, I think it has ruled to an extent in Guyana's favor. I don't know that that it's going to be accepted, because some of the information that was presented. You see, when we go back to the history of this thing, this is British gunboat diplomacy that caused this thing to happen. All right, the British did this in two places. They did it in Guyana, in British Guyana, where they took a chunk of Venezuela and added it on to British Guyana, and they took a chunk of Guatemala and added it on to British Honduras. There's still a British garrison in Belize because of this issue with Guatemala, because they have not given up the original claim they have to that territory. So there's going to have to be some kind of compensation for what happened in the past, and Guyana and Venezuela is not going to surrender that. Every school child knows that Venezuela goes up to the Essequibo. They all know. I mean, I say they know that, and that is not something that they are going to surrender, especially given the current natural resources that they have in that part of the world. That's fundamentally what I was.
Mm-hmm. That's a very attractive portion of land.
Yes,
very potentially very, handsome for both sides. Each one, either one. So, gentlemen, your final kind of wind-up comment on all of the issues that we've talked about in relation to the diplomacy or the lack of diplomacy that was exercised by the Prime Minister. What are some of the matters at stake, and how are we going to resolve them? And a question that we haven't dealt with: is it rare that the Americans are going to be going after the two or three battleships, going after the drug cartels? And I don't know if we can project the success or failure of such a venture. What of you? Take a choice on who goes.
I think Lynch, Dr. Lynch, I think in an article that I read on Facebook, he mentioned that this does not solve that problem. This kind of thing does not solve the thing. This requires education. This requires diplomacy. This requires all kinds of things. Gunboats have never been able to deal. I think it's the work by Lynch that I'm referring to here, and I endorse that. I endorse that very, very much. If you want to deal with the drug cartels and the fact that Venezuela is indeed an entrepot for the narcotics trade, they have made some arrests and so on in recent time, but you're not going to get very far by making the state responsible for that, and that's what this thing is about. If you conflate narco trafficking with the Maduro regime, that's where the problem is going to lie. And I am not sure to what extent. I always tell people, a lot of people did not like Stalin at the beginning of World War II, but when the Germans invaded, they saw something completely different from the Soviet people. If you do anything in Venezuela, you're going to likely have a lot of resistance against the presence of the Yankee, to put it bluntly. So go ahead, Tony. Go ahead.
No. You go ahead. You ahead. Finish off.
I'm just saying that I have a feeling that this is going to boil down like Baji, not fully, because they think it's going to be there, and the threat is always going to be there. I don't know if they're going to do as they did in Iran, launch an attack and destroy a few oil installations and so on. I don't know if the US will do that. It will not go down very, very, very well. Or if they think that enough has been served by just being there and rattling the sabers and causing a lot of unease, because it is causing a lot of unease in Venezuela, with some people probably hoping that the Americans come in and save them, which I think is very, very futile. But when it does go away, I think we have a lot of rebuilding to do with Trinidad and Tobago. We have to try to be a good neighbor to everybody, including the United States of America, and in particular to Venezuela and Guyana, because we have mutual interests that can be served by being in each other's good graces.
Right. Tony Paul, your final comment. How do you summarize all of this?
No, I think your first guest, Mr. Lynch, made the point that as a consultant and an advisor, he can be analytical. He can give his advice based on his understanding of the situation and his experience and knowledge. And I think the customer, the client, eventually makes a decision. And that may include putting other pieces of information that the customer has, the client has, into his decision making, as well as its own strategic interests. Right? So, whereas we may think that we have a different understanding of the situation than we do, of both parties, the United States and Trinidad and Tobago, and the decision makers, we have that perspective. They have some other perspectives that we don't necessarily know about. Whether we trust them or believe they're valid is a different story. Now, in good governance, what we want as a people is for our government, our leaders, to be clear with us on what is driving their behaviors. What is the strategy behind the decision making? We can see what we think as people, and the opinions coming out show that some people are for and some are against for different reasons. What is the big differentiator from those points of view? And maybe they will come out. The big point I've heard made is about the narcotics trade and the crime that comes with that. That's a noble aspiration. Now, whether or not that is a valid target for this approach is, as Professor Watson just said, something that Mr. Lynch pointed out, maybe questionable. So really, what is the driver, if not that? And if that, maybe we need to hear how that might work. So my thing is our transparency of our decision makers, our leaders, on those kinds of serious decisions that have implications.
Surely any attempt to deal with the cartels must also involve the countries and the governments around. You don't stay in the Caribbean Sea and move the drug dealers, the cartels out of business. It requires far more than that. And perhaps the thought is that you will frighten them into non-existence with the gunboats moving around the region. But gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for your input into the discussion. We have stripped it apart, and I'm sure that there is far more discussion to be held, because as the situation changes and evolves and we see a clearer picture coming out, I am sure I will call on you again to have a chat with us. And Charlo will tell us about this program being repeated tomorrow, so that people who may not have got all of it or who want to listen to some of it again will know. So Charlo, over to you. And just indicate that for Wednesday and Thursday, you have my colleague Andy Johnson taking over this program. So I am Monday and Tuesday, Andy is Wednesday and Thursday. Enough for two old people to work.
Thank you very much. All right.
Have a good evening. Thanks very much for inviting me. Always a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the guests for being here on the Drive Time Exchange on your TT Radio. People, rerun of this program is tomorrow morning at 8:20 a.m. on New Era TT Radio, newerattradio.com. And of course, you can also get it on our YouTube channel at New Era TT Radio. It will be posted there shortly, and you'll be able to watch it over and over again. All right, stick around, don't go anywhere.
Okay.
I'm telling you, nobody, nobody. When you really think of it, nobody wins a war. Because the agony of defeat will linger. Nations still hating one another and superpowers looking for more power. As long as violence and aggression still dwell in the hearts of man, brother, the war will go on. It cannot be won. No, the war will go on. It cannot be won. Fallout from war is chaos. Plenty agony, plenty pain. Economy theft in